Today we're going to be working with multiplication and division with integers. And probably multiplying and dividing is the easiest of the operations that we can work with integers. The key concept, we have to remember that a negative means opposite. Now, when we take a look at multiplication, we know that multiplication is shown by arrays. So if I have the problem 2 times 3, it means I have 2 groups of 3 things. Therefore, I have 6 things. Now, if I have a positive times a positive, my answer is always positive because I never take the opposite. So if I have 2 times 3, I know it's 6. However, if I have 2 times negative 3, my arrays stay the same. I still have 2 groups of 3. And the world of integers always starts with the positive numbers. So I always build my array always with positive numbers because the negatives are simply the opposite of the positives. We had to have the positives first. So here I have my array of 2 times 3, but I need to take the opposite once, which means I'm going to flip these positive one time to get my negatives. That's why a positive times a negative is a negative, because I flipped it once across that 0 on the number line and I'm now on my negative side. Versus if I had a negative times a positive, again, I'm going to start on my positive side. So I have my 2 groups of 3, but I have to take the opposite once. So I switch from my positive side of the number line to my negative side of the number line. Therefore, a negative times a positive is always a negative. Now this last one is the one where it really starts to make sense for people, because notice I'm going to take the opposite twice. So a negative times a negative. Well, I start on my positive. I take my opposite once, therefore I'm negative, but I got to take my opposite a second time. That's what brings me back to my positives. That's why a negative times a negative is a positive. I want you to think about being on that number line. So you're starting from the positive side, and if you take 1 negative, you're flipping over to the negative. And if you take 2 negatives, then you're going to flip back over to the positive. It's literally about going back and forth between the positive and negative side on that number line. Therefore, we can start to think of some rules. And I always think, if the integer signs are the same, so if it's either a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative, your answer is always positive because I'm thinking about how flipping works. Versus if you have 2 signs that are different, a negative times a positive or a positive times a negative, well, you only flipped it once. Therefore, you have to be sitting on that negative side. Therefore, that has to be negative. So most people just memorize the rules, but I wanted you to know why the rules were working. Now, division works exactly the same way. Now, the model is if I have 12 things and I'm going to put them into 4 groups, how many things are in each group? Well, again, we start off always in our positive world. So if I have my 12 things and I divide them evenly into the groups, I can see I can get 3 positive things in those groups. Now, once they're in the groups, if I have a negative, I flip it once. So it would change from a black to a red. Therefore, I know that a positive divided by a negative has to be a -3. Versus if I have 2 negatives, that means I have to flip it twice. Therefore, a negative divided by a negative, flipped it to the negative, then I had to flip it back to the positive, has to be a +3. And if you have 1 negative here and a positive there, we know it's got to be a negative. So it's the same rules. If you have 2 signs that are exactly the same, it's got to be positive. If you have 2 integer signs that are different, then it has to be negative. Ooh, I need to change this to make these different right there. So let's change that. Let's say if we have a positive divided by a negative, then we get our negative. You always have to think about that flipping. So that's how I envision what's going on. Think about going back and forth between the positives and the negatives on that number line to explain it, but in the end, you're probably going to want to just know the rule. Good luck. Have fun with multiplication and division.